So we're working through the survey results still, and we're trying to tease out some other things. But of people who came and did the votes at the open house, they were putting we give them these little glass chips, and they put them in jars. It was interesting to hear that people were really excited about education. They wanted more opportunities to learn on the island. They wanted to learn about the historic research, about the historic features that were out there, and they also wanted to do things like guided walks. We don't have a ranger program that does walks on the island the way that you can do that on George's right now. So that was a really interesting thing to hear.
Alice Brown is the Director of Planning at Boston Harbor now. She is working to promote and expand water transportation options, including the development of business plans for new ferry routes, and she is also shaping a vision for Harbor Walk 2.0 to make the Boston waterfront and harbor islands more accessible and resilient. Prior to joining Boston Harbor Now, Alice worked at the Boston Transportation Department, at Sasaki, and at Livable Streets. Alice holds a master's degree in urban planning from Harvard's Graduate School of Design. Alice, why don't you raise your hand, because they won't know which one's Alice and which one's Cheri. Thank you, Alice. Next to Alice is Cheri Ruane, who is a registered landscape architect with a master's of landscape architecture from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. She is currently a vice president leading the landscape architecture practice of Weston and Sampson Design Studio, a Boston-based design practice within a multidisciplinary environmental and infrastructure firm. Cheri has intentionally focused her career on landscapes in the public realm that improve quality of life. Her work includes waterfront parks, urban downtowns, public commons, multi-use paths, and harbor islands. Please join me in welcoming Cheri Ruane and Alice Brown.
Rather than standing up here and doing a lecture, since we think most of you already know and love Peddocks, we're just going to have a chat, and then we're going to sort of invite you into that chat. But before we start talking too much, we want to know a little bit more about who our audience is. And so we're going to ask you to stand up if one of these things applies to you, and then stay standing. And if you're sitting at the end, we've got some special questions for you. So please stand up if you've ever lived on Peddocks Island. Summers, year-round, you're a Peddocks Island resident at some point. Well, no, stay standing. We love you residents. We want to know who you are. Stand up if you've camped on the islands. You've been there, you've done an overnight, you've camped on Peddocks Island. Stand up if you've just visited the island. You've been on Peddocks. You know what Peddocks looks like. These photos are not going to be super confusing to you. All right, if you're sitting, I'm warning you, some of the photos are not going to make any sense. Stand up if you took an online survey or came to an open house. You've been part of the Peddocks Island Vision Plan this summer. Stand up if you're excited to learn more about Peddocks Island. Hey. All right, thank you all. We're excited to be chatting with you over the course of the next, well, we will not be chatting for a whole hour, but we will be with you for a whole hour. Here we go. Mm-hmm. Most of you have hopefully seen this map, but the Boston Harbor Islands are part of a national and state park. There are 34 islands altogether. 4 of them are now peninsulas, so you can drive there. The rest are only accessible by boat or very brave swimming. And Peddocks in particular is right off of the very tip of Hull, known as Pemberton Point. It's the second largest island in the park. The largest one is Long, but it's been closed to the public. Most members of the public can't go there. So it's really the biggest thing you can get to out in the park and on the islands. And as I mentioned, it is part of this national park, so that gives it some special privileges that we'll be going into a little bit later today. Most people who visit Peddocks Island take a public ferry. There are public ferries that leave from Long Wharf right here in downtown Boston. Other ferries leave from Hewitt's Cove in Hingham. We can talk later about why the ferry routes and schedules are what they are, but this is a Peddocks Island presentation, so I'll put that off. And starting this past summer, we were finally able to reintroduce mooring balls out in the harbor. So for many years, there had been some debates between the Coast Guard and the Army Corps of Engineers and some other folks about where mooring balls should or should not be. And if you don't love where they are, I'm sorry, but finally there are mooring balls back on the islands. There are about 69 of them out there today. There'll be more in the future. They're all provided thanks to a service called DACWA. So you can get there by boat, and now you can get there by more different kinds of boats. So this is a basic context for Peddocks Island. But I'm going to turn over to Cheri to talk. Cheri, tell me a little bit about what you love about Peddocks Island.
Well, I think the first thing that struck me the first time I went out to Peddocks Island was really the sense of discovery that you have out there. You are only a few miles away from Boston, but boy, does it feel like you are in a completely different part of the world. And I think, there's these amazing moments on Peddocks. This is actually a freshwater wetland that's sort of perched up on Westhead. Beautiful, stunning, only a few feet away from the ocean. So that's magnificent and amazing from an ecological perspective. The next image are the things that you come across as you walk along the beach. So this little valve cover that sort of looks like a face. Those are the types of things that you come across. They're from ships, they're from other homes, there's a lot of refuse, a lot of tires. And that too feels really magical about Peddocks. And I think maybe one of my favorite things that we discovered, was we did an off-season visit in February so that we could really walk through the woods and find some of the assets, some of the buildings on Easthead that haven't been mapped digitally. And in the crawl space of one of the lookouts, we found this USGS marker, number 3, for Fort Andrews. And it was hidden down in sort of this basement space. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is number 3. We got to find number 1 and number 2. It's just an amazing place out there that you see things that you just would never see anywhere else in the area. What about you?
I think it's interesting, when you walk around Boston, you see actively how buildings are being reused. So you have, in one extreme, you have a former bookstore that's now a Chipotle. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have a space like this that was set up very much like this when people were stoking revolutions 250 years ago. So you have these polar extremes of how spaces are used, but they're still buildings as buildings. And when I'm out on Peddocks, I'm blown away by spaces like the Whitman batteries. This was a gun battery. It was designed to be a place that people shot things from. There were no trees there because otherwise you couldn't shoot things and have them go anywhere. And there was never an intention that it would feel like this. It would be this kind of space. And to go there now is a very, very surreal experience. You don't feel like there was war there. It's like it was built to be this happier place. And I've heard that there are student groups that come out there and they put students there and make them just stand because you can usually, other than the airplanes, hear nothing but nature sounds. And so having that experience is really powerful. I loved that the second time I ever visited this space was when there was an art installation there where someone had made giant acrylic samoras, like the little Norway maple helicopter things, but giant ones, and hung them over the space to remind us of just how different it used to be, that these trees sort of didn't belong there, and so there are these fake pieces of tree there to tell us that story. And then the other thing I love is just like what Cheri mentioned. We did this winter trip, and we went with the rangers to find things that had never been digitally mapped. So they appear in historic photos, they appear on paper maps, they'd never been digitized in their GPS coordinates. And so this is a radio tower that was just, it's so well preserved, and they put so much attention to detail in this building that is now just covered in vines, and you couldn't find it in the summer if you tried. And you'll see later exactly how weirdly remote it is compared to the rest of the fort. So for those of you who are less familiar with the island or who have very personal stories but haven't nerded back thousands and tens of thousands of years, the island is significant because it's made up of a series of drumlins. Drumlins are a glacial feature that you can find any place that there have been glaciers, and there are different ways glaciers retreated, and when glaciers retreat and leave sort of dollops of earth in their path or in their retreat, those are called drumlins. And I've seen drumlins in different parts of the country, but the only place in the United States you can find drowned drumlins that are like half buried and submerged is right here in Boston Harbor, which is why it's a national park. Otherwise, they'd be like, yeah, you got islands in your harbor, so does everybody else. But the National Park Service recognizes drowned drumlins are this wonderful, rare thing. And you can really see in an image like this that there could have been, with sea level rise, there may still be 4 separate islands. But instead, at low tide today, they're just connected enough that they are one island. And you can see this now if you look out at other islands and maps. You'll notice like, oh, that's a 2 drumlin island, and that's a 1 drumlin island, and that's a 1.5 drumlin island. So this is the ancient. You could have come here several tens of thousands of years ago. You could have seen this, and then some humans arrived.
Indeed, they did. So way back, way back. There is history, there is evidence from Middle Archaic period where shell middens, which were Native American vestiges on the island, they found arrowheads in that area. So there's evidence of as far back as Middle Archaic, which is 8,000 to 6,000 BCE. And then that continues to evolve. There's more evidence, and Native Americans then start to settle seasonally on the island. They start to spend summers on the island, fishing, horticulture, agriculture starts to develop. That's 3,000 to 2,000 BCE. And then we get into really, I think, the last piece of it before the colonial period was 1500 to 1630. We know that Native Americans and the Massachusetts Indians lived in the Boston Harbor Islands. And although we have no specific information about Peddocks, it seems highly likely that they were out there and occupying.
Yeah, that first phase we know about simply from archaeological evidence. So we can go out there and say this shell midden, this pile of shell remains is from this period, this arrowhead is from this period. So archaeologists are doing all of that. But that 1500 to 1630 time is a time in which we have oral history, we have oral tradition, we have people who shared that history with people who were then writing it down when they arrived. And so that's how we know a lot more about that particular period of time. Around 1622, some group of Europeans arrived, and in some way that is not clear to us today, they purchased the island. They purchased the island along with what is now the town of Hull, Nantasket Peninsula, and that started to change the course of the island.
It did.
You want me to keep going? So from its early days, the separate town of Charlestown, that was not part of Boston, needed a great place to store their cows where they couldn't roam too far away. And an island is a great place to do that. You stick the cows out there, they can't go anywhere. So it was a common pasturage for the people of Charlestown, and it was a great place for them to get firewood and wood to build their homes. Once they'd started to deforest the peninsula they were living on, they just reached out to Peddocks Island and took some more stuff. Then the town of Hull, became the town of Hull, then took ownership of the island, and they used it for similar things. So they were doing more farming out there and then sort of commonly storing all of their goats and sheep. You can leave them on the common, but someone might come by, or the sheep might wander off. Not a problem on the islands.
And there was a limit of 6 cows on the common at that time.
True.
Incidentally. So
Cheri's working on the Commons master plan too, so she's a lot of fun facts about the
a lot
common.
of cattle facts from that time. But so once they sort of extracted the natural resources from Peddocks, the town of Hull acquires the parcel. There's some residential use. And then through the end of the 15th century, the cattle...
17th?
Sorry, that's right, the 1700s. This is when now that the trees have been removed, they start to use it for horticulture and for farming. So there's a lot of crops that are happening out on the island. What's next?
The troops.
Yes, the colonial troop.
This is. Can we do the troops?
Yes.
They were storing their cows out there,
Yes.
and then the British were evacuating, and they
Yes.
wanted to make sure the British didn't get their cows. So they evacuated the cows before the British could evacuate Boston.
Yes.
So no British got any cows.
Right.
But then they wanted to fortify it. Once the British were gone, they wanted to make sure the British didn't come back. And so first the colonial troops fortified it, and then when some Frenchmen showed up to support the colonial troops, they did some more fortifications. So Exhibit A on military base.
That's right. And the French also supported it with a lot of the earthworks.
Yeah.
The map, about 1817, that's when it starts to show structures on the eastern shoreline of Easthead. Those were the first buildings that were out on the island, and they were owned by the Cleverly family. And they were fishermen, and they were farmers, and they were harbor pilots. So they were really the first family that sort of built an estate out there. The town of Boston at the time, 1822, it was incorporated as a city. And the farm continues to expand through 1847 all around Easthead.
Most of you have heard, if you are familiar with Peddocks at all, you know about the Portuguese fishing village. For those of you who don't know about this, there was a group of fishermen, primarily of Portuguese descent, who were living on Long Island. And when the city acquired Long Island, they had to move. And they said, well, we're not just moving, we're moving everything. So they put their houses on floats, and they floated them over to Peddocks. They settled there originally on Easthead, and then when the military took over Easthead, they just did the same thing. They floated their houses down to Westhead, which is where some of the cottages are today. And I would love someone with better historic knowledge than me to tell me how many of the cottages today originally were cottages on Long Island. I think not many, but that whole culture of cottages starts to develop from that time.
Exactly right. And that's really when leisure and vacation start to become a larger part of the American culture. And so in addition to these cottages, now we start to see a hotel. The Willows opens. That was a hotel. There was a restaurant there. There was a casino. Rumor has it there might have been a brothel. So there was a lot of commerce and busyness on Middlehead and Westhead. We do know in a couple places that I think the News Corps at the time came out for a big baseball game. And there were also lots of big events that happened out there because it was remote. And so people were able to really recreate with
The
reckless
local version
abandon.
of Vegas.
That's right. Yeah,
Great.
what happens on Peddocks stays on Peddocks.
With the exception of the U.S. military, who arrived and then shot things off of Peddocks. So the military first acquired Easthead and then more and more and more of Easthead, starting in 1898, but really all the way up and through World War II, they were continuing to do things. So we talk a lot, well, and we'll have more on this later. Actually, we can transition into that. This is what Fort Andrews looked like once the military had built it all up. If you travel the coasts of the United States, you can actually find a lot of these buildings have twins elsewhere, or quadruplets or quintuplets. The military would send you a stack of bricks and some building plans, and you'd build your barracks, and they'd send you a stack of wood and some plans, and you'd build your chapel. And so a lot of what we have out here isn't exactly one of a kind, or wasn't one of a kind then, but today they're among a very small number of buildings that look like this that are out in the world. You might notice some really important things for those of you who've been to Peddocks recently. There are no trees in this photo. I think about how nice it would be to be a soldier on Peddocks today, where you could lounge under a tree on a hot day in the shade. There was no shade. Zero shade. This is what the island looks like. You can actually you lose in this the number of contours, the sort of beautiful level of steppedness that you can experience when you're there among the trees today. And I'm going to see if this little thing works. Way over here, that's my radio tower that like no one ever goes to anymore. That I showed you the picture of. So this is what it looks like, and if you think, gosh, there are more buildings out there than there are today, we'll get to that in a minute. And this is what the Whitman gun battery looked like when it was full of guns and not tree leaves. So it spends a lot of time as the U.S. military. When we say Peddocks spends a lot of time, I should say Easthead spent a lot of time as being the U.S. military. I know we have someone here today who spent part of the 40s and 50s out on the island in the summer. Again, there was always this cottage community, the islanders living, at least in the summers, out on Middlehead. So that story is also persisting.
And there was the remains, actually, the fence that was the divide between Middle and Easthead is still there today. And we remember hearing that, you would wander around Middlehead and go right up to the fence and then turn right around and go back the other way.
Yeah. And then it becomes a park. Originally not DCR. DCR is a new creation of the merger of the MDC and DEM, but it was built or designed to become a state park, designated as a state park in 1970. In 1979, Suzanne and company created the Friends of the Boston Harbor Island, so it went from just being a park to being a park with a friends group that had all sorts of benefits with that. And then in 1996, legislation was introduced in the U.S. Congress by Congressman Gary Studs, and was part of this huge bill that created a lot of new national parks and national recreation areas across the country. And so the Boston Harbor Islands National and State Park came out of that. At the time, there was a nonprofit group that had just begun that was designated in the legislation to be the nonprofit partner to this massive partnership, and that was the that was the Boston Harbor Island Alliance. The Boston Harbor Island Alliance persisted up until 2016 when it merged with the Boston Harbor Association to become Boston Harbor Now, where I work today.
This is the part where I jump in.
Yeah, it's where you jump in, talk about the plans that were done in the early days.
So in the late 1990s, there was an organization called the Counselors of Real Estate. They still exist today, and they help organizations with pro bono work, where they help look at land and try to strategize about development and revitalization and help to do sort of economic modeling. Well, they took a look at Peddocks Island, and they said, well, first and foremost, there's a lot of historic assets on this island, way more than the state and the National Park Service can maintain. There were buildings that were falling apart. They had asbestos, lead in them. And so the Counselors of Real Estate worked with, at the time, MDC, but now DCR, and National Park Service to identify which buildings should be stabilized. So that meant fix the roof, stabilize the walls, make sure they don't continue to deteriorate, and which buildings need to come down. So in that image that Alice showed that had no trees and a lot of buildings, on East Head, there's a second higher point that had officers' row. And around that whole sort of middle of that drumlin were these beautiful homes.
This part.
Yeah, that part right there. And the higher up an officer you were, the better your view of the ocean. And so those buildings, some of them have been maintained, but many had to be taken down because they were just falling apart and becoming a public safety hazard. We've met a ton of people in this process who have lived, summered, visited the island, and we met a couple of members of DCR who will remain nameless to protect their identity, who said that they used to live in Hull and they would come over in the summer in their rowboat and they would break into those houses and go in and sort of find all of these remnants of that time. Because when the Army left, they sort of just left. They didn't really pack up and move out. They just left. So there were a lot of amazing relics that were in these homes. And now that they're grown-ups, they have returned to a more protective mentality about the island. So the report took a look at what's happening now, and it said, you got to stabilize your assets. You really need utilities out here. And so that was a big investment that was made in about 2008. Utilities were run under Hull Gut, water, sewer, and electricity in order to provide the island with services. That was a big deal, and it made a big difference to identify Peddocks as a place that can be revitalized and provide more access for more visitors. So buildings were stabilized, hazardous materials were removed, some buildings were demolished, the Welcome Center was built. These things start to happen, but all based on that initial report from the Counselors of Real Estate. So that was their first phase. That's what you should do out there.
Well, we should. I'm going to really quick jump to some photos. So these are the existing conditions of the chapel and what's now the Welcome Center before they were revitalized. The Welcome Center, what was the guardhouse is now the Welcome Center. It's a really nice building if you've been out there recently. It no longer is covered in vines. And this is where you can now flush a toilet because there is this sewer line from the town of Hull. And then this is what the chapel, I didn't have a good zoom in, but it makes it look really beautiful here. It's been really beautifully repainted thanks to the Carpenters Union. In total, the process for demolishing buildings, stabilizing buildings, removing asbestos. There was so much asbestos on this island. It was valued at about $10 million worth of work, and the water, sewer, electricity, et cetera, cost about $5 million. There's also been major investments in the yurts, so if you've camped out there in one of these lovely structures, that's another investment that was a recommendation of that plan.
That's right. So that was sort of the short term. These are things you can do to improve the island. And then they actually had a longer view that was 10, 15 years out. And they suggested things that ranged from educational facilities, laboratories, a bed and breakfast, sort of retreat facilities, maybe a conference center. They wanted marine-related facilities. And they were really promoting public-private partnerships, things like maybe the aquarium could do an animal release site from this island. They were really starting to try to think as broadly as possible. And a lot of that was great inspiration for how we've moved forward as our part of our process.
Yeah.
And if you haven't stayed in a yurt, there's twice as many now than there were before. And now they have electricity to all of them and ceiling fans, which is amazing when it's really hot. And anyone who has tried to stay in a yurt, you know that you have to sign up for the alert on the Reserve America site. So it alerts you when they're going to go online. And at 9 a.m. on the day they go online, you got to get on there and you got to reserve whatever day's available, which is why I'm always out there on like a Tuesday, because they sell out in one day. And the yurts are booked for the entire year. So now there's twice as many, which is awesome, but they could be filled. Many, many more could be filled. It's magical to be out there in one of these yurts overnight.
And I'll also add that some of this work has been done by a group called the Student Conservation Corps. I mentioned also the Carpenters Union. One thing I think is really cool that they've done recently is these buildings, like I said, were part of this huge stabilization process, but this tiny detail is that they've added, I didn't think I would use the laser pointer, it's so cool. They've painted over to make it look like there's windows here. That's just wood boards, and for years it was just a wood board. But now they've tried to make more and more buildings look inhabited or look like they might actually have windows. And it's these small things incrementally each year that the DCR is working on to make it feel better and homier and more welcoming to visitors. Cheri mentioned that there were lots of ideas that were in this Counselors of Real Estate plan. What else could you do? What else could you try? Whether it's professional landscape architects like Cheri or people who work in planning jobs like me, we're always trying to find ideas for what's working elsewhere. So I'm going to pause on Peddocks and just tell you 3 short stories. The first of these is this space. It's called Carvalho Point. It used to be called Fort Baker. It was owned by the U.S. military, and that is the Golden Gate Bridge in the background. So it's part of it was incorporated to be part of the town of Sausalito. And this is a space that was it was turned over to the National Park Service in the 1970s, but it remained in active military use. They did a lot of trainings out there. There were soldiers in this facility up until the year 2000, and in 2006, they worked with the Golden Gate, I've got it written down here so I get it exactly right, the Golden Gate National Recreation Area and their nonprofit partner, which is similar to Boston Harbor now, to convert this into a lodge. So it's, they preserved up to about 20 buildings, and then they added 13 more. It's a conference center, it's a place that does weddings, and they had the benefit of having buildings that were continuously being used up until they were renovated. But they were able to use historic tax credits. It lets lots of new people come use these buildings in ways that they're not just sitting there, they're actually being, people are staying in them overnight or for a whole week or 2 weeks at a conference. Another example is a place that's really, really near and dear to my heart. I don't think anyone else in my office would tell you this story, but the National Park Service took over an area called the Sleeping Bear National Lakeshore in 1970. It's the place where both of my grandparents had summer homes at different points, actually before I was born, and one stayed up there and year-round, and that's a place that I then went almost every year as a child. In the 50s and 60s, people were driving all over the sand dunes in dune buggies, and the dunes were eroding. There was more and more private housing being built right along the waterfront, and when the National Park Service came in, people were like, how dare you, national government, tell us how to use our lakeshore? And I've talked to some of those people recently, and they're mostly really grateful that that's what happened. You can now visit this really wonderful historic fishing area, some really cool historic farms, and then this is Manitou Island. It's one of 2 islands that was the first place between Chicago and crossing all the way across Lake Michigan to go anywhere else. It was the first place you'd come across an island or a lighthouse or anything. So there's a really incredible lighthouse on this island, and they're trying to figure out, in the same way that we are, Islands, they're much more complicated than things on land. How do you get people out there? What is the camping experience? What if someone can't camp, but they want to spend the night? What do you provide for them? And so they're dealing with some of the same challenges we are with a much more limited ferry schedule. I'm very proud of ours compared to this. And then this is another example locally. It's called Baker's Island. It's right off the coast of Salem. Has anyone been to Baker's Island? A couple people. If you've been there, you've probably got there by a boat that feels like it could have stormed a Normandy beach. They don't even have a docking facility on this island, but they too are trying to figure out, with the 11 acres of it that's controlled by the Essex Heritage Foundation, how they can get people out to this island, what it is to spend the night there, what it is to do historic interpretation there. So we're not alone in this, and I think it's been really interesting in this process learning from other people about how they're trying to do things. So now that we've gone through all of this, we've been learning all these things, we've been doing a plan. You're all, I think some of you are here because you're doing a plan, tell us about the plan. We are creating a plan. We're creating a plan for several reasons. First of all, as we've talked a lot, there are these incredible historic buildings on the island, and the counselors of real estate had ideas. There was a lot of stabilization done, but that next step to figure out what beyond the guardhouse and the chapel can be revitalized, what kinds of uses would be good out there, that's something that we're trying to figure out. What will it take to revitalize those buildings so that we can preserve them and not just have them be monuments to the past? We want to increase visitors to the island. We know that some of that has to do with ferry service, and creating more ferry service will increase visitation, but we also know that some of that has to do with just what's out there today. There's no place to eat, there's no place to refuel or restock on anything except for refilling your water bottle. And so we got to figure out how to do this combination, this chicken-egg problem of providing a few more amenities and then getting a few more visitors. And so within that, we also hope, it's part of the mandate of Boston Harbor now relative to the Harbor Island in general, is that we're trying to figure out how to generate revenue that can be reinvested back into the park. So that's already happening in the concessions, that's already on the other islands like Spectacle and George's. It happens in ferry contracts. Whenever we're able to generate revenue out on the island in any way, we invest it right back into the park. Similarly, we're developing, whether it's projects, we're developing programs, whether we're talking about infrastructure, whatever we do, we want to figure out how to do it in a way that captures what it is to be Peddocks. We can look at those other islands, those other parks, and say, what are you doing? How is it working? But we don't want to copy it. We don't want to just be like, we're the Governor's Island of Boston. Governor's Island is a New York thing. They can do their New York thing. We're not importing New York things. We're trying to figure out what is the essence of Peddocks that we can use as we develop things out there. Some people will tell you the island is perfect just the way it is. I too completely love it, but there are certainly things each time, there's a nicer path, or there's like better stairs, or I'm not climbing over a briar bush to get that great looking blackberry. I appreciate it. And so we want to make sure that the overall island visitor experience is really welcoming to everyone. And in doing that, we want to both honor history. We've talked a lot about history tonight, but we're preparing for the future. As Suzanne mentioned, there are definitely climate change issues out on the islands. They will gradually separate in that there will just be higher tides, and at high tide, there will be less and less connection between them. We also are super aware of erosion, and I believe Paul Kirshen is here somewhere, though I didn't, there is Paul. Paul is working with Boston Harbor now on another project that was discussed as part of this speaker series to think about the climate change implications for the islands and doing research on how better to protect them moving forward. So we're trying to balance that in what we do. What have we been up to?
Besides putting the slideshow together, we've also, in fall of 2018, we did start doing a lot of data collection. So we were able to go out to the island quite a bit. We talked to a bunch of residents. We had our infrastructure engineers take a look at the sewer, water, and electricity out there just to make sure we understood capacity. We also started to look for initial ideas about how this island could be revitalized. And I think the word revitalization is important because, as Alice said, we don't want to just look at precedents and duplicate them. That was not the intention. And also, there's a very fine balance between revitalizing and overdeveloping. And so we want to pay very close attention to what makes the most sense, what can be done successfully, and how could any sort of proceeds from that go back into the island. The way that the state is set up now is if you generate revenue, it goes to the general fund, and then The governor decides where that goes. We would like to set up a formula that allows money that's generated on Peddocks to be put back into Peddocks, to put a shower out in the yurts. That would be amazing. People could stay more than a few days and still have their family love them, at least. So we did an internal stakeholder workshop in December. That's where we got National Park Service, DCR, some of the counselors of real estate came, Boston Harbor Now, and we did a design workshop. And we strategized about really what makes Peddocks great, what do we know are the things that people are passionate about, and how can we leverage those into a revitalization plan. We continued to do analysis into the winter and started to strategize about concepts. What would work out on the island, what's working now, what can be expanded, and maybe what are some of the ideas that we've heard or thought of, and let's see how they fit or don't fit. We also were working on a management and a governance strategy for the island, and this is important because that formula, that payment formula, where, there's money generated because of camping on the island, that goes to the general fund. Well, if we set up a more strategic governance and management strategy, that would allow the money to be put back in. It would also allow us to charge a little bit more of a market rate. Right now, campsites, I think, are $20 or $30, and the yurts are $50 a night, which is amazing and a steal. But as more and more yurts come online, this could really be something that could generate revenue to help sustain Peddocks and to help to prevent erosion and to help to develop laboratory space or other components that could really make this a resource. Our off-season site visit where we discovered those buildings up on East Head, what we noticed was there's actually a very healthy deer population on the island. A few folks found antlers that had been shed, which was amazing, like 6-point antlers. We realized as we were trying to make our way through all the invasive vegetation, greenbrier and bittersweet, is that if we just followed where the deer walked, we actually could make our way around there pretty well. So we just thought like a deer and moved through the landscape, but it's amazing how far-reaching they are. And I was out there a couple times this summer, and right at dusk, they will be running all over the place, interested in you, but not enough to get up close. So we worked through the winter, we refined concepts and started to consider development proposals, and checked back in with the working group to vet these things. And that's really where we said, okay, it's time to go out into the big wide world and do a public process and find out what people think based on the research, what we know, and what we're thinking to get a reaction to things. And we did get a reaction to things. We then moved into this summer where we looked at some pilot projects and programs. The public survey, which is online, continued, and we started to generate cost estimates and visitation projections for what it meant to implement some of the possible plans, so we knew what order of magnitude we were looking at. Whether it's sort of dormitory style housing that allows classes to come out, or is it a bed and breakfast? What do those cost and what's the return on that investment? Just so we understood from a financial perspective what made the most sense. Boston Harbor Now in July released an RFI, which is a request for interest, to groups that might want to do some programming on the island. And I think you had a pretty wide-ranging response from folks as far as possible programming. And through the public process, we also heard from folks, one individual wanted to do a seaweed farm, another individual wanted to run like a fishing school and a bait and tackle shop on the island. So it was helpful to understand sort of where people's heads were at as it related to Peddocks.
So we did a series of open houses this summer that were part of our public engagement strategy. So we had an online survey that about 1,600 people took. So thank you if you were one of them. I think at the time that we developed it, the original questions were formulated in March, and we were like, oh, some people will come to the open house, and one of the stops at the open house will be this survey. And it will just be a thing. It will be like a part of this larger thing. And in the end, the survey has taken off and become its own creature in ways I think we did not imagine. And if I could go back and do it over, I would add way more places to get more just different ideas. Tell us about this kind of idea. Tell us about this kind of idea. Instead, we sort of imagined it as a stop at this open house. And the open house was also designed to say, these are different ideas we've heard from state partners, from federal partners, from these past plan, from places people are doing on other things people are doing on other islands. And if we put that all together, here's an array of options. So we would lay out these boards here. This was on the Rose Kennedy Greenway at the Visitor Center. We did this in we did this in Hingham, and then we did this in an evening session in downtown Boston as well. So people could come and sort of just look at these ideas and vote for ideas. And it wasn't about these are the ideas. It was just to sort of share this visually of what you could possibly imagine on the island. We also had a lot of resources and collected feedback. So people came and told us stories. So we were documenting, what was your lived experience. In the front and center in this picture is Susan Kane, who's one of the people who oversees the islands for DCR, the State Parks Department. She was collecting stories from people. We were getting people to put stories on timelines. People brought different artifacts from their time on the island. Suzanne came and shared even more stories with us because she is wonderful like that. So we had all these different ways that we could share both our research in terms of things like sea level rise, et cetera, and then people could share their personal stories with us.
And one of the former residents of the island brought a menu from the Willows restaurant where steak was 5 cents and a lobster was a quarter. Yeah, it was amazing. It's in pristine condition. It was really beautiful.
Yeah. And I will tell you that there are different things we're doing with the survey data, and we're trying to sort of sort out who is from Boston and who was voting from Florida and how were they voting for Florida. So we're working through the survey results still, and we're trying to tease out some other things. But of people who came and did the votes at the open house, they were putting be given these little glass chips and they put them in jars. It was interesting to hear that people were really excited about education. They wanted more opportunities to learn on the island. They wanted to learn about the historic research, about the historic features that were out there, and they also wanted to do things like guided walks. We don't have a ranger program that does walks on the island the way that you can do that on George's right now. So that was a really interesting thing to hear. People were all about invasive species management. Once they were like, oh, those plants don't belong? Yeah, let's clean that out. There might have been a goat in a picture, which made it really compelling. People also talked a lot about renewable energy and resilience measures. We think it's significant that while utilities were run from the town of Hull, we really hope that in the future we can move the island back off the grid in really sustainable ways. People wanted accessible waterfront camping. They wanted tiny cabin glamping. They wanted site amenities. So that was things like elevated boardwalks. Shade structures were really popular. And then, there was less and less interest as we went down. Arts and culture, the popular thing was having some kind of stage, some kind of art. And then hospitality, people were like, maybe a winery, brewery, cafe. But we were sort of working our way down. And because I was trained as a mathematician, we have our N value of votes totaled. So we're still working on this plan. I think I do planning a lot, but the islands don't get that much planning. So this is sort of normal, and people are like, this isn't normal. It's normal. Plans take a long time. Even when they say it's a 9-month plan, you just double whatever people tell you. So we're in it's a 9-month plan right now. We're really trying to put together a vision so that we're not just taking these disparate ideas, but we have one comprehensive vision for Peddocks. And we hope that some of that comes out of our dialogue with you here tonight. We will be releasing, hopefully, a draft plan by the end of the calendar year. It might be January, but we're hoping to get it out at the end of this year and then have another way for the general public who isn't nerdy enough to come out on a rainy Thursday night to the Old South can weigh in on it. We'll finalize the plan in the spring, sort through those pilot projects. We've gotten pilot project suggestions for over a year now as people have heard that we're working on this different plan. And it's been interesting to hear about what people are ready to move forward with and what people are like, oh, this thing is missing, right? So if they have an idea to put something on the facing Boston Harbor right now, but they need power, there's no power that gets out that far. So not an insurmountable hurdle, but these little tiny nuances, or the size of the boat that's available for the weekend. They want to do a thing. It's like all these little factors have helped us learn where Peddocks could be improved. So we'll hopefully have some new pilots out there next summer. In terms of selecting the projects, we're weighing different ways to move things forward. Some things were really popular in the way people voted at the open house. Things were really popular from the survey. We want to look at things that increase visitation. We have a set of economists on our team who can sort of study that and forecast that. That's what economists do. They can also determine if something is a good investment on a per visitor basis and or whether it's a return on capital. Mm-hmm. But then over all of that, we want to know, does it align with what it is to be Peddocks and what does it mean to be part of this vision? So there will be ideas in the plan that are about that visitation piece, and there will be ideas in the plan that are just about making the island better. So some things might generate revenue, and some things will just be things that would benefit the island overall. I am super cognizant of the time, and so I want to sort of wrap us up here by saying thank you. We do hope to continue to expand programs and ferries and moorings even before we make any physical changes to the islands, and we want to keep listening. So we're going to pause. I think Erica and Suzanne are going to give us some questions from cards, and then we'll go around the audience and get some more questions.
How might potential development affect archaeological resources on Peddocks Island?
The most archaeological sensitive part of the island is Westhead, and that is a part of the island that our plans do not intend to do anything other than improve shoreline paths for. I believe the next speaker in this series is actually the City of Boston's archaeologist, and he is someone, Joe Bagley, he's someone who can tell you all about that careful process. But I think there's no chance that this island is going to have any changes that don't take that into account. I think there's been a lot of disturbance. We talked about everything from the French fortifications to all of the Fort Andrews stuff on Easthead, but I think we'll continue to look under the surface before any physical changes are made.
How extensive is the potential for plumbing? Easthead only, all, etc.
So, as it turns out, the water and sewer capacity that was brought over from Hull is good, but it's not amazing. So it can support the visitor center, it can support a bit more development, but it's not going to be able to handle thousands and thousands of people every single day. So what we're actually looking into, and part of our analysis of the island, was a renewable energy audit. So we looked at wind, we looked at solar, we looked at geothermal, and we needed to understand too what's the possibility of septic and composting toilets and that sort of stuff. So those have all been taken into consideration, and the intention is to leverage the capacity they have now to build out a bit more. Like we said, maybe there's a shower at the yurts that are closest to the Welcome Center, and there's more accessible water. And then dovetail that in with renewable energy resources and more off-the-grid resources to try to provide additional amenities. However, Easthead is really the most likely and accessible to receive most of that. We did look at East, Middle, and Westhead, and there's an area on Middlehead that would be ideal for a solar panel array that would generate a lot of electricity based on its solar orientation, and right now it's covered with Norway maples and bittersweet vines and other things. So it's just something that we're evaluating that potentially starts to expand the capacity for those utilities.
What's on top of Westhead?
I mean, it's a drumlin with trees.
So Westhead is like, it's hard to get around over there. It's the least inhabited or least developed of all of them. I think there's one building or two buildings. And we've sort of bushwhacked our way through a bunch of it. It is, from what we can tell, mostly really dense vegetation. There's some stone exposed. There's probably things, relics that are out there. I have also heard that on the top of Prince's Head are a couple of old relics, like another USGS marker and some other things. It's on my list. I'm getting up there. But it's really hard to access in the summer because of the density of the vegetation that's out there. Okay.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the ecology of the island and preserving it. And at some point, because I've been out there from the night, as I told you before, I started going out there in the 1945 era as a kiddo. There's a lot of stories about plants on the island that don't exist on the mainland because when they grazed, the colonists grazed the sheep out there in the burr of their sheep, striped fur rather, there were seeds. And so that there are plants out there. What are you going to do about the kind of vegetation that is there now that you don't want to have disappear?
Right. So in managing vegetation in general, we take a lot of care in understanding what is out there, what is native, what is exotic, and then what is invasive. Sometimes it's okay to have exotic vegetation, non-native vegetation, as long as it's not crowding out other habitat. So as an example, those Norway maples, they are really good at reproducing. They're very fast growing. They're a European shade tree. They create some of the most densest shade for any deciduous tree, and it blocks the ability for there to be understory growth. So it really limits ecology. Not a lot of birds and bees and bunnies can live happily under those trees. And it really, because they are so successful, they overpower natives. So in many cases, what we've found is that original vegetation has either been choked out or shaded out or diminished. And what it takes is the removal of those invasives, the strategic removal of those invasives, to allow that original seed bed to come back. So we need to be careful. We don't want to just deforest the whole place and then have erosion issues and, kick the deer out or anything. The idea is to do it really strategically and in a way that allows native and more supportive vegetation to move in as the invasives are sort of thinned. So there are a few plants that are super aggressive and have just been going at it out there. There actually was the only northeastern or New England kudzu crop was out there, and it was like taking over. And so Mark Schwartz from National Parks, or from DCR, had to go out and manage it because it was taking over the island.
So I've camped in one of the yurts. They are lovely out on the island, and I'm impressed by the fact that it's a very interesting mix on Peddocks of being out and away and in nature, but then we had the flight plans right above our head at 11 at night, and I was like, wow, that's loud. And you have party boats right off sometimes at Peddocks. And I was curious, as you're talking about expansion, at the time I went, it was, I think, the first year the yurts were there, so there were maybe 5, 6, I don't know, and not a lot of people around. But I'm curious, it's a big island, but it's not that big, and it's very close to urban areas. How are you looking at the balance of development versus losing some of the reasons people want to go there, which is it's a little more distant, there's nature, and a different feel for someone who lives in an urban environment for the most part?
So I think some of this is, there's two things. I think one, any development that happens there, any changes that happen there can be really gradual. And I think we're going to listen in here and say, this is starting to feel like a lot of people, or this is whatever. There are some Saturday nights I've heard out there when they bring out the Boy Scout troops, and there's a lot of humans, teenage humans on the islands, and it might be a little loud, but also teenage boys with counselors, you can't usually drink, so then they're they go to bed at some point once they're done being boys. So I think we do want to make sure there's a mix, and that the people who are coming out to Peddocks are part of a culture that says this is a place where we respectful of one another, and we're all out here to enjoy the quiet and not the loud. But it's also recognizing that Peddocks is part of this archipelago. So Lovell's Island, Bumpkin Island, Grape Island all offer camping experiences, and camping on each of those islands already feels a little different. Each one is a little bit different. And as far as we can tell, those are going to be, the intention is to keep them as silent and tiny as possible. And so it's only on Peddocks that we're even considering introducing, double the yurts or a bunkhouse in the barracks or something.
Right.
So it's finding that balance.
The point is well taken, and it's something that we're always considering and thinking about. You know, you don't want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. You really want to be careful about that and to be thoughtful and to be strategic. But I will say, just on Easthead alone, there is a lot of area that is untapped and untouched and inaccessible, completely inaccessible. Even around the fort, if you were somebody with a disability, you'd have a real hard time getting around, even just at the basic level. So I think some of the improvements that we're talking about, you know, maybe paving a loop path around Easthead and introducing bicycles. People could ride a bike around Easthead and park it back at the Welcome Center. That would not necessarily, as Alice was saying, that's not going to draw a lot more visitors, but man, is it going to be a more enjoyable experience and a more inclusive experience. So we're coupling the improvements with, you know, things that may introduce more people. It's interesting, when I was there a little bit later this past summer, so all 12 yurts were occupied, and it's the first time I'd been on the island when all 12 were occupied. And, you know, there was a line to the composting toilet. I was like, there's a line on Peddocks Island? What the heck's going on? But in such a warm and awesome way. Like, families were there, and people, you know, you can have a beach, fire on the beach. And this was actually a super magical experience that I've been able to recreate a couple times. You make a fire on the beach below the high tide line, and you pick a day when the tide is coming in around 9, and the tide comes in and it puts out the fire. It's amazing. It is so amazing. And you see the Boston skyline in the distance. Like, there's just nothing like it. And everyone is looking for something like that, but in a super respectful way, because other folks were like, oh, we'll look for a spot on the beach. We'll go around here. We'll go around the corner and be away from you, because I think people respect that.
Yeah, I just, one of the major things I really miss about that island is the overgrowth, the jungle aspect of it, going back 10 years. Recently I go there, it just seems like it's been given a haircut, and almost just, the other islands are like that, Spectacle, they're almost too open. And it was just so charming in that island. It was the Raiders of the Lost Artifact. And there was a mistake. They should not have torn down a lot of those red brick buildings. I know that real estate council made a big blunder, but it's water under the bridge now, so I'm not going to be negative on it. But that was, so please preserve every other building. You don't have to do them up perfectly, but just, you know, they could be like dormitory style camping without, it doesn't have to have high amenities out there, but I think you should preserve that, the wildness of it, and fill in
Still have the picture
with some,
of the vegetation
you know,
on here.
maybe managed northern jungle, you know, it's just.
Have you been to Bumpkin recently?
Not recently. I've been going out to that island for 40 years, and all the islands, so I've had a boat for like 40 years also, but it's just so, I miss the wildness of that island, and I would, you know, just
There's still a
hate to
lot
see
of
it
places on
over-commercial.
Peddocks that are pretty darn wild. There really are. There's a lot of paths that you have to duck down in order to get under the vines. Even just around the yurts, they have some of the batteries up behind the yurts. Those are totally and completely overgrown. You have to really scrunch through them to get through. I think it's what they've focused on, what the caretaker and the staff that have been doing that have been focusing on, is making sure that the main pathways are clear and the main stairway is clear, and that you can get up some of the roads, but there's a lot of spaces that still are pretty jungle-esque, for sure.
An island that has many places where you can go and discover something new, and discover something that makes it better to do things that you have done. I used to go to this island when I had more time, and every time I went there, I would make it a point to go to some part of the island I hadn't been to. And there is no end to it. The little things like the building just sort of to the right on the slide had a basketball court, and it apparently was in pretty good shape. And so
It's still there. We saw it.
he put in some effort. And takes less effort because that work has been done. A lot of that work that has been done, I've got lost in every part of that fort.
Yeah.
In the woods, because it's briars and it's prickles, but it's the question was what's going on out in Westhead, having a way that you can have transport, having the Clivis composting toilets, have a place where you can put them that are closer to the dock when you get off. And when I first, I think you still start going there, there were 3 Clivis toilets. They were all within 200-300 yards of the docking area.
Still back there.
So, but making that a part of things like that, but how do you deal with it, are part of what's going to make this happen. And last thing is that you've got a group out there you were talking about that has Suzanne as a leader, that you have people who have been there for 30 or 40 years. It's a good place to start if you want to have a grounding, if you want to have people you listen to, if you want to have all of those surveys of, among them, things like a island-wide survey of plantings and trees, or whatever. So it's all a lot. We'd like to see them step up, and I think we'd like to have there be an opportunity for them to step up.
Great. I don't think there was a question, so we're going to go to the next. That was great remarks. We'll just keep going.
We had somebody
Erica.
over here.
Thank you both for such a lovely presentation. I went to Peddocks for the first time this summer, and
great.
almost didn't get off the ferry because I was thinking of going to Spectacle. But got off the ferry and walked around, and your presentation, I think, did a good job of explaining what I imagined the development would be like on the East Head section. But one of the things that surprised me this summer was the vibrancy of the Middle Head region. And I was completely blown away. I was there on a busy, hot summer day, and I understand the real estate is a bit complicated in the middle section with the ownership ending when the current owners, they're not able to pass on the ownership. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what or how that Middle Head development factors into what you see as your project, or is the Middle Head so complicated that it needs to wait until the ownership evolves?
I think that's a great point about the ownership evolution, and that's the Department of Conservation and Recreation is the one that owns the island, and so they're the organization that have put forth that I guess proposal that current owners may stay there and they can't pass it on. And as that current owner passes on, the house gets returned to the state. So in some cases, folks have turned them back over to the state early because they're old and they're hard to keep up. In other cases, cottages have been abandoned and they've become unsafe, and some have had to be demolished. But certainly there's a really robust and wonderful history right in that area of that was the original Portuguese fishing village. That's the original place where these cottages were moved a second time. And I think that there's a part of the island story that is really importantly captured there. So in some cases, and some of those ideas that you saw that we'd put out for people to react to, there was the thought of restoring some of those cottages and allowing them to be viewed and seen so that people could understand the history. But I think you're right, is that we need to let the state sort of work through what they need to with the owners before we can propose anything. Yeah.
Okay. I want to really encourage you folks to listen as much as you can to people like Steve and Anne-Marie and people who have actual lived experience on the island. I was very involved with the beginnings and all the way through with Spectacle. And of course that was the beginning, so much has been learned, but that never happened. Like there was never any elicitation from families. And I've done something about that. I held a reunion out there for people who had lived out there with my dad. But it just adds such a textured layer when people come to visit the island to know what has been the history, the lived experience of people. And while you still have people here who lived there, it would be great to make sure that they get a say.
Yeah. Thank you.
I do, however, have one question of admittance that I'm very curious about. You referenced the engineering report on that slide, Weston and Sampson, and I was wondering if you could, other than discussing all the undergrowth, et cetera, mention something about what's in that report, if I recall correctly, about a hotel or scientific community or whatever, a considerable amount of infrastructure that you have not mentioned that I can recall in the last hour and a half.
You mentioned a report, and I'm asking if you were asking us about the things that were like images at the open house.
Now, I understood that this was going to be a bit more of a balanced presentation, that we could discuss some of the plans.
So there isn't a plan. There were
What is the Weston and Sampson that has been online?
Right. So the images that the Weston and Sampson created were for part of the public engagement process. So they had, here's a bunch of ideas. If we put them on an island, this is where we would put them because they visually put them out there. But there isn't a plan yet. So we're taking ideas from each of those concepts to make the final plan. Mm-hmm. But those images were not designed to say this is the plan.
Right. We truly wanted to consider what had been proposed before by the counselors of real estate, consider what we had heard as possibility, look at other precedents, and just say, okay, from do absolutely nothing to do something fairly intensive, what does that look like on the island? What does that cost? What is the impact? And get feedback on that. And then our task now is to take that feedback and to develop the plan that's appropriate for Peddocks.
Yes, but I think if you are spending the last hour and a half with pastoral visions and not even mentioning that some of the possibilities include, as I said, an extremely large hotel, et cetera, you are misrepresenting what are some of the plans that are under consideration.
We did reference that some of the ideas that have come up include conference center, bed and, okay, well, those were just part of the public outreach process, and now we are listening and working on coming up with a plan that will be appropriate for
yes, but there's
moving
a whole
forward.
Engineering plan that the only reference is on that slide that has not been brought up for any kind of discussion. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk, and it's been very interesting. I'm kind of a virgin to Peddocks Island. I've enjoyed Spectacle and George's Island, and I wonder, since so many people have enjoyed it, lived there, whatever, why is this taking longer than the other islands to develop, and where does the funding come from? Who decides that type of thing?
Great question.
Yeah, so so we mentioned earlier there are 34 islands in the park. Each island has its own backstory, and for a while each island had its own ownership. So the state, and it was actually 2 different state agencies at the time, owned about 16 islands, and then when the National Park Service came on board, an additional 18 were added. So some are owned by nonprofits, some are owned by whatever. So there's a really complicated ownership structure, and even now the federal government owns 0 islands. They're just the partner. They bring funding, they bring a lot of support. They don't bring ownership. Some islands had different uses. So Spectacle, was a dump. And so to cover the dump was not a contentious thing at all. It was like, yes, it sparkles from glass. Let's cover it up. And there was conveniently fill that needed to go somewhere, and they decided that the Ted Williams tunnel dirt should go to cap the island. So there was a need for, all the pieces came together, and that happened. Because Peddocks is a place that some people have lived, people have had a whole other set of experiences. There's the fact that the fort is there. There's no fort that's like it anywhere else. George's had been a place that, was a very tidy Civil War fort, right? Like it has its very concrete history. The fort was in really good shape. It was also built so that it'll probably outlive all of humanity for quite some time. It was already a place that people visited all the time. Peddocks has this weird in-between status where it didn't consistently have ferry service, and it has all these different residency things. And so I think it's just been a lot more iterative in how it's happened. But yeah, I wish they were more holistic and we could give you a nice flow chart of how we made basic decisions.
But it's a great point, because people usually don't make it past Spectacle or George's. And to get to Peddocks, in many cases, you need to lay over in George's and have the lobster roll, which is amazing. But it makes it an 1.5-hour, 2-hour trip. So I absolutely get it, and it's something that's part of this thinking.
In regard to the question about why the presenters hadn't covered some of the options that had more aggressive development options, maybe I'm wrong, but I remember reading in the Globe that path or that concept had been rejected as being too out of keeping with the character of the island. Did I imagine that?
I think you had the most benevolent interpretation of that Globe article.
Oh, could you explain the article then?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Sure. So it's. I will tell you, I've worked on other planning processes. My background is mostly in transportation planning. And in transportation planning, people have lots of strong opinions, often about parking and how much they love or don't love bicycles. These are the two things that come up really. You can go anywhere and say transportation, these things come up. I think planning on an island hasn't happened for a while. That the plan for Spectacle Island was there was ideas in the 80s, and then suddenly the big dig was happening and probably got lost in the big dig shuffle. And so for this plan now to both intentionally try to include public engagement in a digital era, working with a landscape architecture firm and not real estate people who write up reports but don't have any graphics, has posed some challenges in terms of communicating what it is to do a plan for an island. And I think hopefully in giving us the time, thank you, tonight, to tell a clear story about the history and why we're doing a plan, you're like, oh, that makes sense. And I think people saw the images that Cheri's team is really excited. They have all these ideas, and they said, what if all these things happened? And some people read it and said, all those things are happening and they can't happen. And some people said, well, I don't like that version, but okay, we'll take some of it. It was hard to communicate, and so we've gotten a lot of interesting press coverage. And even journalists, as you walk them through this process, some people hear this and some people hear that. And some people read that same Globe story and called me up and told me all the things that could never happen on Peddocks Island. And I said, thank you very much for your feedback. And we agree that some of those things aren't going to happen. We just wanted to share a lot of ideas. And if you read the article and said, great, that's too extreme, they won't do it, that's great. That's where we are. We would never do all the things in that image at once or in total.
Right.
It's actually a pretty basic question. This has been really fascinating to me, and I'm really impressed by the very rich history of this island, and I'm wondering if there's any systematic effort to capture and preserve the artifacts, the stories, whatever. It just seems like it's a really ripe opportunity to keep a treasure.
So almost everything we've shared with you tonight, other than the photos that Cheri and I have taken, exists in some report that some government agency has done. We have not had to go back and capture that much history because so much is in one report or another, but some are digitized and some are not digitized, and some are written really beautifully and some would put you to sleep. It'd be good bedtime reading. So we do hope that in our plan we can both summarize it and then direct people to find more of that. And then I think the one missing piece now is figuring out how to do a better oral history capturing. And I think that's a place where we really appreciate the effort that Suzanne has put into this amazing book. If you haven't gotten your amazing book yet, you should. Because she's not here, I'm going to tell you, my boss has a really awesome photo in this book that we've all been enjoying. This is a great way to capture things that have happened on the island. And if there's anyone here tonight who doesn't already part of the Friends or hasn't shared their story with them, I think in part we've looked to them as our archivists on a lot of this. And I can't tell you the number of amazing things Suzanne has in her personal archives that she has sent to us, and we've learned a lot from that. Maybe you want to make some closing remarks.
Some of you know, most of you don't, but I've been a Peddocks Islander. I had a cabin on Peddocks going back to the early 80s. And tonight I was fortunate to meet the Damagelis clan here. What's your first name again? Anna Maria. But when I bought the cabin, they were allowed to be transferred, the ownership. And Lillian Beauvais, my friend, bought it from Anna Maria's grandparents, the Damagelis. And I heard that name the whole time I was on Peddocks, because they made the most beautiful chimneys on the cabin and planted the grapes and the pink rose bush. But back to oral history, I think this could be a great Friends project to build on what's already been done. Tilly B. Sylvia wrote a wonderful book, Once Upon an Island. It's out of print at the moment, but that's a fabulous history. And there's islanders that are here tonight as I look around the room, and I know that there's many people that would like to contribute their story, and we should talk about it at our next Friends board meeting, how we can perhaps take this on as a project and get more photographs and do the digitation aspect, the interviewing, and because we do have a special collection at UMass Boston, a Friends Archives, a special collection. But the stories are just fabulous, and meeting you tonight is another example of how people are connected.
That's right.
Yeah.
And all the artifacts that people have found on the island, actually when we were walking around in the winter, we found an old iron rake that was potentially used by one of the prisoners of war in their gardens. All of the things that have been found have been given to the Welcome Center, and they have a table out on the front porch that often has all of these pieces and parts, old ship parts that have washed up, the rake. It's amazing. So it's definitely informal, but it exists. There is all the artifacts are sort of being collected.
And what we could do is perhaps an audio tour of Islander stories, so when people are walking around Middlehead and Westhead, if they can do it at Alcatraz, we can certainly do it on Peddocks Island.
I agree.
All right. Well, thank you all. Thank you so much for the presentation. Thank you all for your questions.